Hello, and welcome to this edition of People in Transition. I'm your host, Bob Gerst. I've been hiring, firing, and mentoring executives, frontline employees, interns, and job seekers in companies around the world through a host of transitions, some difficult, but most very good. I work with people in Hong Kong, India, Australia, and across the United States. What sets them apart? A lot, but there's more they have in common. And one of those commonalities is transition is a part of life. This experience has given me a bird's eye view on a variety of trends, economies, industry disruptors, and transitions that are big and small. It also brought me into contact with the thought leaders and decision makers you need to meet, the people who can make the difference that matters to you right now. Imagine knowing exactly what to do next and how to know it's time to make your big change. The insight track you're going to access during our future episodes is better than a crystal ball. It's the exact information you need to take that next step. Whether you're a new grad applying for your first professional job, someone looking to transition your work experience into a promotion, launching your own company, or maybe even starting to plan your retirement, you're in transition, and this series is for you. We all know transition can be scary, but it doesn't have to be. And it's even fun when you have VIP access to the future you want. Are you tired of the uncertainty of being passed up? We'll share with you the tools and skills that can take your dreams to the front of the line. So, if change is on your horizon, or maybe just the thought of change, you won't want to miss this discussion. It could be the exact edge you need to turn transition into an amazing opportunity. Eric Pringle, thank you so much for being on this episode. I'm so excited about this discussion. Appreciate your taking time.
Thanks for having me, Bob. I really appreciate being on here.
That's great. We're going to really give our listeners some real value today. Eric, some of our listeners might not know you. Why don't you take a little while and explain how you got to where you're at today?
Well, I actually started my career as an HR person, so I always like to joke that I'm a recovering HR guy, but always grew up around the human resources function. My father was an HR executive, and my grandfather was a union president, and my grandmother was what they called a personnel person back then. So I think I was always around a dinner table when there were a lot of those types of discussions going on, and I think it just naturally led to me going into the people business, if you will. I started my career with Amoco Oil Company, which is now BP, and was an HR generalist for them with their IT group, and then with their production company down in Houston. I left there and went to go work for Wells Fargo in the financial services industry as an HR person for what is basically all the ways you can bank without actually having to go into a branch. So telephone banking, ATMs, and kind of the beginning of online banking, which we all kind of take for granted now as the normal way to do business. And then I got into the telecommunications arena with US West out in the Denver area and served as the director of HR strategic planning for them. Back in about 2000, I left and started a company called Integrated People Solutions, which I've owned and operated ever since. And we primarily focus on executive search and executive talent management practices. And we also do offer outplacement services through a strategic partner called OI Partners. And so we've been kind of intimately involved, either as an HR person or an external provider of transition services for a long time now. I always kind of think for as many roles as we've filled, I've, for better or worse, been involved with some pretty massive downsizing activities. So I don't think I'll ever actually place as many people as, unfortunately, as I've been a part of outplacing along the way. So this will be an interesting conversation today.
Certainly have expertise in both bringing people in and the transition that entails, as well as moving people out and the transition that entails. Let's focus first on the bringing them in. My experience has been that many people don't understand what the executive search business is all about. Why don't you take a couple of minutes and explain that to our listeners?
Basically, we work with companies to find great leaders for their businesses. In our case, that tends to be a lot of manufacturing companies along the way. So it'll be in the hiring of C-level, VP level, and director level roles to help them kind of bring in the right leadership to drive the culture they want and the productivity that they're looking for. And, what we do is I would kind of liken it to fly fishing a little bit. Each search is unique. We're looking for kind of that right fly for the specific fish that you're trying to catch. And so they tend to be kind of unique and discrete roles. And I think they're very rewarding because when you find the right leader, you can really drive a lot of great change out there. But that entails, canvassing the market and specific target companies, identifying the people out there that are the best in their field and trying to bring them in to allow them to showcase and help further the cause of our clients.
How does a candidate utilize the expertise of a search firm?
I think there are probably a lot of different ways you can utilize them. And I always encourage someone who is actively searching for a role to develop a number of different relationships with various executive recruiters. You might contact somebody at one time and they might not have an opening that fits your role at that time, but they might, 6 to 12 months down the road or further into your career. And so I think it's good to always kind of network with some of the bigger firms and then also with some boutique firms that specialize in your particular industry or function along the way. I think we're kind of a good tool to have in your toolbox.
Is finding a job for a more junior level position different than the C-suite searches that you do? Is finding a job for that more junior level somehow different?
I think so, because most organizations have almost like a pyramid-like structure. There's one CEO. There might be a number of people that work down on the floor, and there might be multiple job openings for those types of roles. But there's one CFO, one CEO, one chief people officer, one COO. And so I think when you have folks that are at the more senior ranks, they have to be fairly patient because there aren't as many openings in that arena. When you're earlier in your career and you're in a role where there are multiple openings of a specific role that you might be qualified for, it's a little bit more fruitful, and you can probably expect that that's going to be a shorter timeline to success.
Eric, let's say a friend just calls you and tells you they've lost their job because their company is going out of business because of the COVID crisis, and they ask for your advice. What's the 3 or 4 things that you'll tell them that they should do now?
Really, sometimes it depends a little bit on the function and industry that they're in. We might tailor that advice a little bit more. But I think the first thing that someone needs to do is really embrace and get comfortable with the situation that they're in. I think it's always jarring for anybody to lose their position because we invest so much of ourselves into our jobs, and sometimes we maybe let it define ourselves a little bit too much. But I think the very first thing you need to do is get comfortable with where you're at and process that loss a bit. And then you need to quickly turn the page and get focused on, in a perfect world, what would your ideal role be? And how do you either attain that role or at least take the right step in the right direction to build yourself towards getting into that ideal role?
How do you coach someone to deal with the stress of being unemployed and looking for a job?
It's interesting. I can only kind of speak from my own experience. When I worked for Amoco, we went through an oil and gas crisis back in the early 90s, and we ended up laying off thousands of people. And ultimately, it meant that for the folks in my client group, it impacted that organization enough where my role actually went away, and I was on the other side of the equation, and I was utilizing some outplacement services. And frankly, I think psychologically, I had spent so many months delivering people bad news that I was actually ready to make a move at that time. So, the first thing you need to do is just kind of accept where you're at. I think so many folks kind of focus on why they might have been selected to leave versus somebody else. If it's the kind of situation, and I think we'll see this with the COVID crisis where an entire business shuts down, you really can't take that personally. And I think if you're the CEO of an organization that shuts down entirely, it'll be impossible for you to do that. But for the rest of the people, they'll be able to, move on fairly quickly from that. in terms of processing, why did somebody, if it's a situation where the business is still running, but they had to take a certain segment of the people and outplace them, really kind of processing through what your victories were while you were there and learning how to take those forward, because, everybody has wins in their roles and you need to kind of utilize that to build your confidence. And I think, always be learning. I think we can all kind of look back in every role we've ever had and think about what we learn not to do and what we can do better in the future and how we can build our skills and our communication skills, our people skills, our decision making. Always be training yourself to get better. And it's kind of a long way to get to the answer to that question, but once you process through that, I think you'll be able to get focused on what your next move is. And I think it'll also help you in the interview process. If you're still carrying a lot of emotional baggage around the loss of your role, it will kind of consciously or subconsciously present itself in the interview. So I think you need to get really comfortable with yourself so you can answer questions about why you left your last role.
Yeah, I heard someone being told once while they were in transition that they came across as playing the victim card. I thought that was a little bit harsh. But what do you think the sender of that message was trying to say, and what should the recipient take away from that?
I think it gets back to processing loss. No one ever likes to be described as a victim. And I think most of us work hard to take ownership and be accountable for where we're at in life. But, I think what the interviewer is really trying to say there is, I'm not feeling enough ownership and accountability from you on this. It's not projecting well in terms of how the candidate might be able to take that and make it a useful thing. I mean, I think it's actually a good question, and you almost have to take the question as advice, if you will, to say, hey, what do I own here? What could I have done differently that might have led me down a different path here? At the same time, don't beat yourself up so much. In the process, I think we can be awfully hard on ourselves when we lose our job.
And your earlier advice in terms of processing your victories, you almost need to remind yourself sometimes on a daily basis the things that you have been successful in achieving or working on or whatever, because it's really easy to see, the dark side of it.
Absolutely.
Eric, how should you use LinkedIn or other social media tools while you're in transition?
Social media tools are kind of a tricky thing. I think LinkedIn has been a really nice kind of business version of social media. And I think a lot of times when we're working, we're so focused on delivering results in our current job that we often fall prey to not keeping our network up. I think LinkedIn provides kind of a valuable, easy way to keep up with those people we've worked with in the past, as well as kind of develop new networking relationships. And sometimes you kind of see you want to go work for company X and you might not know someone there, but as you start to research who some of the key decision makers are in the organization, you might find that you're just 2 degrees away from somebody, and you might be able to utilize that to work with one of your current contacts to make an introduction for you to a decision maker at a company that you're interested in working at. Mm-hmm. And there's nothing more valuable, I think, than when you have a kind of a third party introduce you to somebody. It gives you a little immediate credibility.
You mentioned networking. How would you help someone who is not good at networking be better at it and more comfortable at it?
I went through an exercise in business school that actually talked about networking a little bit. And it was really before the advent of things like LinkedIn and Facebook, before those were real pervasive forces in our lives. And they said, hey, I want you to draw a picture on a blank piece of paper. And we want you to start with a circle in the center of the page, like it's the center of the universe. And that circle is you, and you write your name in there. And then they asked you to identify kind of the top 5 best people that you've had in your past, mentors, former superiors, et cetera, maybe customers that you were really closely tied to, but who are the 5 biggest influencers in your life that had taken a personal interest in your career? and kind of draw that as a kind of a spoken hub model, if you will. And then to really, speak with those people and identify 3 people they would recommend that you speak to around your career. And, when you see that and you keep replicating that further out, it just shows you kind of the power of how quickly you can grow your network with very personal connections. When you use social media, it's kind of the same concept. It's just electronic and a lot more efficient and fast.
Both good news and bad news can get out there faster. What if you've pushed the envelope? You've posted that picture of you at the Christmas party dancing on top of the table, or somehow got engaged in some kind of discussion about politics, religion, whatever. What do you do in those situations?
Well, if you posted it, take it down. I think it's more dangerous when somebody else has posted that and you don't have as much control. Hopefully you have a good enough relationship with that person, but you could ask them to take it down. The reality is that none of us is perfect, and we've all said things that we wish we hadn't said along the way. And so I think getting a little bit of control of that is always important. I did a kind of a panel in Denver several years back, and it was full of HR executives in the room, and people asked a little bit about this whole social media phenomena. It was probably 10 years ago, so it was somewhat early in the game, if you will. But they were asking about things like Facebook, and I said, you're probably not going to like this answer, but LinkedIn is great, and we're very good about curating exactly how we want to present ourselves on something like a LinkedIn. I said Facebook is a little bit more dangerous because that involves friends and families and maybe some loose connections from high school or college. And I frankly had never heard a good career story that came out of Facebook. And so I said, be very careful about who you connect with in any of these environments. It's kind of like what your mom tells you when you're growing up. You're judged by the company you keep. So I would always caution people to be very careful about who they connect with, what they post online, whether that's through social media or the web. We've certainly seen plenty of stories about CEOs and other company leaders that have posted things that were less than politically correct and ultimately detrimental to their careers. So think about who you connect with and what you put out there.
Not when you're using a search firm, but when you're using other methods of looking for a job, applying through some kind of electronic media, or applying because of a newspaper ad. They still do those every now and then, or just cold call applying. It may be helpful to know that you're essentially dealing with a numbers game. Help our listeners understand what that means in that process.
Fortunately for me, I haven't been on that side of the process as much. I can give you some tips in terms of your resume. Make sure that your resume doesn't just tell what companies you were at and what roles you performed, but some key indications around how well you perform those roles. If you work in sales, it gets a little bit easy because you know how you performed relative to your sales goals and how much you grew revenue year over year or for whatever period of time you pick. If you work in procurement, it's going to be how much did you drive savings and improve the quality of the supply that you got. Those things are important. I would also say you should be very tuned in for whatever your field is. The current key words are that you need to have in your resume, because as you apply into, whether it's directly to a company or in through one of the job boards, almost all of the folks that are actually on the other side of the computer doing the searches are running Boolean strings with search terms in there. And you want to make sure that the keywords that are important in your industry are on your resume, because it'll help you pop to the top. A lot of those tools actually assign a score to your resume and how well it matches that keyword search. So I would be very tuned in to what the keywords are for your industry, for the type of role that you want. Make sure that those words are embedded somewhere within your resume, whether it's in your job experience or even if you have a separate section on your resume that kind of has a key skills section in it. And then with respect to, how do you become more searchable? I think for the more junior level roles, definitely be on the big job boards. whether that's Monster or Indeed or something like that. But you want to get your resume out there a fair amount. As you get into the more senior roles where they might be using recruiting firms or an executive search firm, make sure that you're in the databases for all of the key firms that specialize in your field of expertise.
Eric, how should someone prepare for an in-person interview? What are some of the techniques that they should be looking at using for themselves to be successful in that in-person interview?
I think the very first thing you need to do is really read the job description thoroughly. They're giving you the keys to success right in the job description. They're telling you exactly what the role is, what the key skills and attributes that are required, and what kinds of personal qualities that they're looking for. And so you need to be prepared to answer questions around that. Second piece of advice I would give is make sure that you do your homework on the company. And that has become so easy now with the web. You can even put in some Google reminders to have them, send you news feeds every day on the companies that you might be interviewing with. But make sure that even the morning that you are going in the interview, that you are up to speed on any key news releases that have gone on about that company. I think sometimes people look foolish when they don't realize that there's been a big event at a company, whether it's a key announcement around an acquisition or a new product launch or new leadership appointment. You always look better if you've done your homework. And then in more basic terms, I would say, once you're in the room, make sure that your listening skills are really up to snuff. I find there's so many times where a candidate is kind of fixated on getting 3 bullet points about themselves across during the interview that they're not actually listening to the question. It's really imperative when someone answers or asks you a question that you're actually answering that question and not trying to push some other information or predetermined agenda on them. They're so busy selling that they're not really listening. And so I think that's really key. And a lot of times, as you know, Bob, we tend to like in the HR field behavioral-based interview questions. And so they'll be asking you for specific examples of when you've done a certain thing. And so know how to answer a question. Probably the easiest piece of advice I could give someone, which is probably about $10,000 of interview training in 30 seconds, is remember STAR. And so it's situation, task, action, and result. If someone's asking you for an example of when you've done something in the past, paint a picture of what the situation was, tell them what your task was in that situation, what actual action you took, and what the result was. Hopefully it's a positive result. That's always a plus. And if you can share some metrics about what that result was, it's always more powerful.
What if you have something bad in your past work history, discipline, maybe even fired? How do you handle that in the interviewing process?
It kind of goes back to, how you deal with loss a little bit. Everybody's probably had a career misstep or maybe didn't do enough homework about a job before they went into it and found out it wasn't the right fit for them. I think the best thing you can do is be honest and transparent about it and tell them what you learned from that situation. Everybody knows you've made mistakes. Nobody's going to expect anybody to be perfect. It's kind of what you do with that afterwards. If you say, boy, I got fired because I did not pay attention to a key safety rule, and I realized that is really important. And so in my next roles, I've always been extra careful to make sure I took every precaution to avoid having that kind of accident again.
What if you have an interest in a career change to do something completely different, but you don't have any expertise in that area? You are willing to take a step back. Should you do anything different in terms of your search?
I think that's always the most difficult career move. And I hear a lot of career coaches really try to get people to define what their ideal role was. And it might be something completely different than what they've done in the past. You're always most marketable applying for roles that you've actually done successfully in the past, because they want to see, oh, you've done this successfully. I want a person like that who's a superstar in this particular field. It's trickier when you try to reinvent yourself. But you really have to kind of look at it and say, okay, how do I actually get the training to do that? Who in my network that trusts me as a person might trust that I can make this kind of transition? So I think it's a combination of training, leveraging your network, and you being flexible and adaptable. Whenever someone is hiring you to do something you haven't actually done before, they're taking a big risk. And so you have to figure out how to mitigate how much risk they think that is.
You've talked about a lot of things that work in the transition process. Give a couple of examples of things that are less successful that you've seen candidates do in transition management that hasn't helped them get closer to that ideal job.
When people lose their job, a lot of folks are very tempted to say, hey, I'm going to take a month-long vacation. Or maybe they've gotten a very generous severance package that maybe covers them for 6 to 12 months, and they'll think, I can take a little vacation right now and really think about what I want to do and spend time with my family since I haven't been able to see them in a while. I would resist that urge. I don't think there's a problem with taking a week, maybe going someplace out on the ocean or a lake or something like that, and kind of getting your head together. But at the same time, I would caution taking an extended vacation. I would really kind of look at it like, I'll take a few days to clear my head, but then I need to get really focused on this and really define what I want to do. Look at the industries that A, I want to be in, and B, where I'm most marketable. Think about the next ideal role. And then I think you need to think like a sales and marketing person. And you're going to be selling and marketing the thing most important to you, which is you. So that means kind of looking at an industry. If someone says, boy, I really want to go into food and beverage industry and in manufacturing in some way. Well, it's very easy to actually get online and do some research and figure out who the top employers are in that space in your area and figure out who those companies are, and then figure out who the key decision makers are at that company, and then start networking their way in. And so you really need to think like a sales and marketing person. I think that where people fail is they take a long time off, and then they find it's actually much harder to find their next role than they think. And, we all have shelf lives. I mean, I hate to say this, but you're most marketable when you first leave a job, and you're less marketable 6 to 12 months later. And so the longer you take, the less attractive you are to an employer. And so I think the couple of things I would say is get after it pretty quickly. Once you've landed the job, you can negotiate a start date and take a vacation before you start. There's no more relaxing vacation than knowing you have a great job to come back to. And then really avoiding, a little bit of attention deficit disorder. If you're not really targeted in your search and focused on which companies interest you, who the key decision makers are, things of that nature, you'll find that it's very hard to land a role that's actually appealing to you. You really have to prioritize and go after the things you're most interested in and start working your way down the list.
Eric, do you think that transition management, as we've been talking about it here today, is different today than it was 15 years ago?
I do think it is. And part of it is that, we're in a different world of technology. So there are a lot of tools and resources available now that weren't available 20 years ago. It makes everything easier and faster, but it also makes it easier and faster for all of the other people looking for a job as well. And so your competition in the job market is going to use these things, and you need to be in tune with that. In terms of, how you process it emotionally, I think it's extremely helpful, and there are a number of different resources. Some of those resources are going to be your network. Some of those resources might be an outplacement or transition coach, if you will. For some people, it might even be, if they have a therapist, it might be their therapist. Who knows? I do think that the emotional side is very similar, but I think the tools we use to actually look for roles are much more robust now than they were back then.
Any books or other resources that you would recommend someone look at if they're going through transition?
I like a few of them. Probably the one that I've read most recently that I like is called The Job Search Navigator. and it's written by Jim Durfee. And I really like it because Jim is somebody who has been an HR executive. He's been an executive search professional. He's been an executive coach. And so I think he brings a very all-encompassing, very practical, pragmatic perspective. And we're still waiting for your book, Bob. I'm sure I'll recommend that when it comes out. So
it's in the mail, I'm sure. Eric, if our listeners remember only 3 things as they go through their own transition, top 3 things that they should remember, what would those 3 things be?
The first thing is to get your head in the right space so that you can get focused and that you project well when you do get in front of an interviewer. I think the second thing is to resist the desire to take a long period of time off before you enter into your focused search. And the third thing is to maybe think a little bit like a sales and marketing person so that you can present yourself in the best way possible.
Eric Pringle, every time I speak with you, I learn things. I'm excited about things that you're involved with. I love how you provide value to not only our listeners, but others that you come into contact with. And you're just a good human being as well. We thank you so much for being a part of today's episode.
Thank you, Bob. Always a pleasure to speak with you. And I've learned a ton from you over the years. So I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you and some of your followers.
Thank you for listening to today's podcast. We're working in unprecedented times as the world responds to the recent COVID-19 crisis. The fact is that even those who are not in transition understand it could be right around the corner, next month or a year from now. The purpose of these episodes are to give listeners support and the critical tools to adjust with the winds, wherever they come. I'll continue to introduce you to guests who have successfully, perhaps gracefully or without too many battle scars, survived their own obstacle courses and can share useful information on how to steady your ship or your world in this uncertainty. If today's message was helpful to you, please share it on social media. If you have any questions or podcast ideas for future conversations, reach out to me on LinkedIn. I appreciate your time you're investing in sharing these important conversations with me, my guests, and others who are going through life transition. Transitions between jobs, life stages, new entrepreneurial ventures, or whatever life brings. Change is constant. The more prepared you are for it, the better and easier the change will occur. Thank you again. This is your host, Bob Gerst. See you at our next episode of People in Transition.